Whether you call it kveik, kvik, or kvike, there's no denying that this unique Norwegian yeast has had a remarkable impact on the brewing scene, and Imperial Yeast's A43 Loki is one of the best versions out there. With the ability to produce a clean beer when fermented as warm as 104 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius, you heard that right, while also performing well at more standard ale temperatures, Imperial Yeast A43 Loki is as versatile as it gets, meaning you have zero excuses for failing to brew throughout the year. Learn more about A43 Loki at imperialyeast.com and grab a pouch for your next batch to see what all the fuss is about. Outside of mass market pale yellow lager, IPA is one of the most recognizable beer styles out there, in part because of the seemingly endless versions that have been created over the last 10 years or so. Clear, crisp, hazy, soft, red, brown, black, white. Obviously, modern brewers have taken quite the creative liberty when it comes to IPA, which actually has its roots in the mid-18th century. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to discuss the classic English IPA is English contributor and host of the Brewlosophy Show, Martin Keane.
Classic style indeed. This is a lovely style. I really enjoy the mix of the biscuity character you get with this along with the hops. It's kind of the perfect combination. And you know, I also enjoy this podcast business because unlike the video work, I didn't even have to brush my hair this morning.
Hey, either did I. That's the beauty of this, right? I've been told I've got a face for radio. So this is one of those things. I'm really stoked. This is your first episode, Martin. So I'm really stoked to have you on it, especially to talk about a style that I know is near and dear to your heart, in part because of where you come from. Now, I may not talk about IPA as much as I do refreshing lager, but I've had a sort of obsession with this style since I tried my first one in the early 2000s. And since then, IPA has taken many forms. And as much as I enjoy drinking, well, some of these modern versions, I suppose, I have a soft spot in my heart for that classic English IPA character. As Brewlosophy's true Englishman, Martin, it's no surprise you chose to focus on this style, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you about it, as well as going over your attempt to brew one using short and shoddy methods. If you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. This month, I will be taking the Patreon Q&A stage yet again. It's been a couple of years since the last time I hung out with patrons, and I've gotten a few requests to come back on, so that's exactly what I'll be doing. I say it all the time, but I really am an open book for better or for worse. So if there's something you've been itching to know about yours truly, now is your opportunity. To be a part of this session, you have to make your pledge of just $3 or more over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy no later than Friday, October 27th, 2023, as I'm going to be taking those questions on Saturday, the 28th. All past sessions are available on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Another really easy way to help us out is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when you're shopping online. Your experience won't change at all, and we get a little kickback for the referral. And with the holiday seasons coming up, this is more important now than ever. So if you could do that, we'd really appreciate it. And finally, if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, that'd be pretty rad as well. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who in addition to having a remarkable YouTube channel chock full of great brewing related content, sell what we believe to be some of the best brewing systems out there, all electric, which is pretty amazing. If you've been considering making the move from propane to electric, you owe it to yourself to check out Clawhammer Supply. Whether you're after a 120 volt 5-gallon unit or something bigger like their powerful 240 volt 10-gallon system, Clawhammer has got you covered. Learn more about everything they have to offer at clawhammersupply.com, and don't forget to check out their YouTube channel as well. Listener Brian Fett from, I think it's Nunica, Michigan, or Nunica, I don't know, wrote in with an interesting question that I'm really looking forward to hearing your response to, Martin. Brian said, longtime listener, first-time emailer, thanks for all you guys do. I look forward to my Tuesday morning commute thanks to you. Well, thank you for listening, Brian. After 300 episodes, I can't imagine how difficult it is to come up with new topics that are interesting for you and also for the listeners. Perhaps I have something here worth discussing. Ever since I started brewing, I've noticed that my beers taste different outside than they do inside. I don't know if it's the UV from the sun or the warmth causing the hop aroma to come off the beer. Whatever it is, I have this New Zealand Pilsner right now that when inside tastes like a Miller Lite, but when I'm outside, it tastes like I squeezed a lime into a delicious craft Pilsner. He says he used Motueka hops in this one. I think there's some science at work here, but also some bias due to location of consumption. Let's face it, we're all happier on a warm, sunny day with a cold beer. I would love to hear more on this topic if you find it interesting. Martin, what do you think? Have you had this experience?
You know, maybe after the fifth or sixth one, they start to taste a bit different like that. I think there may be a little bit of perception at play here. But I mean, from a scientific perspective, there are some things going on. I mean, it does not take long for sunlight to interact with a glass of beer and for notable changes to take effect. You can, skunk the beer quite easily. Some of that could be going on, and then you could be perceiving those tastes as something different. But I can't say I've had this experience very often. How about you, Marshall?
I knew you were going to bring up the skunking thing. So when I first saw this email from Brian, I was absolutely thrilled. Why? Because I've had the very same experience. But, when I asked some local buddies about it years ago, we're standing outside in my garage, and as soon as I leave the garage, it was like immediately that beer took on a different character. I asked them about it. They thought I was crazy. What are you talking about? So to be clear, I am not talking about skunking. I have intentionally skunked beers. It happens incredibly rapidly. I don't like that flavor. So that's not at all what we're referring to here. And I think Brian's with me on this. In my experience, if I pull a beer from the tap, or even if I pour like a commercial, beer from a can or a bottle into a glass, and then I just take it indoors or I drink it indoors, it tastes one way. And that's good. It's not a bad thing. It tastes like the beer that I've had a million times. But as soon as I go outside, even if I'm not in direct sunlight, so it's not skunking, whether it's the warmth or whatever, as soon as I get outside, something changes. It's like the malt and hop character gets amplified in some way. And again, I make sure to keep my beer out of direct sunlight. So I know it's not skunking. It doesn't have that skunk character. Brian, I honestly have no idea what's happening. What I presume is that we might just be sensitive to more subtle changes in the beer, and that the warmth of being outside, or it happens even in the winter when it's cold. So I don't know if it's the warmth or not, but something does change. And I noticed that as well. So I can't explain it. Sounds like, Martin, you think we're nuts, just like my friends did, for experiencing this. But I have to thank Brian for writing in, because now at least I have some validation that as crazy as I might be, at least I'm crazy with Brian Fett here. Folie à deux, if you will.
I'm quite envious of both of you, that you can have basically two entirely different beer styles from the same glass and just step inside and outside and it changes.
Well, here's the thing though. When I go back inside, it doesn't change back. It like maintains the character, that this like more amped up characteristic that I got from going. I don't know what it is. And I know that I probably sound really nuts right now, and I'm okay with that. The fact you wrote in, Brian, and you share that experience with me, I want to go have some beers inside and outside with you. So if you're ever in the Fresno, California area, you make sure to hit me up. Thank you so much for reaching out, Brian. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. Hey, don't forget to subscribe to The Brewlosophy Show at youtube.com/@TheBrewlosophyShow. Martin, you've been putting up some amazing brewing and beer related content over there. And last I checked, we were pushing close to like 18,000 subscribers. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, and the feedback has just been fantastic. So we really appreciate all the comments we've seen on these videos, and we're having a blast doing all sorts of crazy things, fermenting beer in bathtubs and all sorts of stuff like that. And the crazy has only just begun, believe me.
I'm so proud of what we've accomplished in just 8 months or whatever. It's crazy. And I'm really confident anyone who enjoys this podcast would absolutely love the Brewlosophy Show as well. Again, you can find it by searching YouTube for Brewlosophy or going directly to youtube.com/@The Brewlosophy Show. That's the @ symbol followed by The Brewlosophy Show with no umlaut. When we return from this break, our focus will be on English IPA. Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Exchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clearer wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Exchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Exchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to exchillerator.com today. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. I had my first IPA back in 2001 when I was living in the Pacific Northwest, and at the time, it seemed the primary focus back then at least was on bitterness and strength. Since then, things have obviously changed quite a bit, and while IPA is still technically bitter, the focus now is much more on hop aroma and flavor, and largely from, these newer modern hop varieties, whether they're New World hops or, the newer American varieties. What I think is cool, though, is how this style actually got its start nearly 200 years ago. Now, when it comes to the history of English IPA or IPA in general, there's a little bit of debate. My understanding, Martin, I'm sure you're going to be able to correct me on some of this stuff, but my understanding is that the basic story, the common story, which we're going to share in a second, is mostly true. It just is missing some details. So most people who have been brewing for longer than about a month, have heard the story of IPA, that in the late 18th century, George Hodgson, who was a brewer at East London's Bow Brewery, began brewing pale ale with increased hopping rates and alcohol as a way of ensuring its shelf life during the long, warm, and bumpy ship ride to India. This bitter, hoppy, and relatively high-strength pale ale was a refreshing counter to the dark porter and stout that Indian drinkers were used to, and so began the rise and popularity of IPA. So this idea that it got its name, India Pale Ale, which it was not called that back then, but it got that name essentially because it was this beer brewed to withstand the ride to, on a ship to India.
Yeah, and I think we've all heard variations of this story, that we have IPA today simply because we needed to put a lot of hops into a pale ale to allow it to cross the ocean for 6 months on its way to India.
Right.
And I think that is true, but there's definitely some interesting caveats to that story as we've been researching it. I mean, firstly, to say that this idea of using hops for beer preservation, that was used from the 1760s, and not just for pale ales, but really for all types of beers. But the other really interesting thing is just about George Hodgson himself and his brewery. So Hodgson's IPA happened to be widely distributed in India, not because it was the first pale ale that was highly hopped, but because the Bow Brewery was close to the East India Trading Company docks. So the Indian traders were quite familiar with his product. And also, Hodgson allowed the East India Trading Company a very generous 18 months of credit before they had to pay their bills.
That is a very good deal, if you ask me, right? Hey, we're going to give you all this beer. You don't have to pay us back for it for 18 months. My understanding, though, is that at some point, and the reason that this Bow Brewery was in East London, right? So it wasn't in the popularly, I think, referred to city, at least when it comes to IPA, of Burton-upon-Trent. It wasn't there yet. That's not where IPA really got its start. Everybody was over hopping their beers for preservative stuff. We know that, right? They didn't call it IPA, but that was a thing that they were doing back then before, the whole IPA thing became what it is now. But my understanding is that because of Hodgson's weird business hijinks, right? He's doing these things, he's offering these lines of credit, and then I'm sure he was doing some, asking for, high interest rate or something like that. That the East India Trading Company got pretty fed up with Hodgson's business practices and began sourcing, this, I guess you could say, version of pale ale, this hoppier, higher strength, which it's not like they were 7% ABV beers back then, but they began sourcing it from other breweries, ultimately settling on some in Burton-upon-Trent. If you've ever heard of the Bass Brewery, that's where that's at. And so there are some familiar names there that come from that area. But one thing that we know about Burton-upon-Trent is that their water profile, which even today we still kind of defer to when it comes to making that crisp, hoppy pale ale, because their water profile was high in sulfates.
Yeah, and it's actually crazy that the reason that we now all use this Burton-on-Trent water profile really does go back to Hodgson's business practices. And one of the things he did was he got rid of that free credit, and he also jacked up the prices as he was really had a monopoly on the market.
Yeah.
And what ended up happening is the East Indian Trading Company ended up dropping him and picking different breweries, including those in Burton-on-Trent. And one of those was the Allsop Brewery. And once they started shipping that, actually the Indian market much preferred Allsop's version of the ale. And that's really the end of the Bow Brewery shipments to India.
And yet Hodgson still gets credited as being, which rightfully so, I suppose, but gets, is the name that's associated with IPA. One, not even in Burton-on-Trent. Two, the guy was we don't, businessmen are never bad, right? He sounds like he was just a crappy business person. But anyways, that is the brief history, if you will, of IPA in general. Obviously, they were using local ingredients back then, and that is where we get English IPA these days. Now, I think we have to have a little bit of a disclaimer here that modern versions of English IPA are based on what we know or what we've read about, historically and in old writings and stuff on what these older traditional versions were like. We've taken it, we've molded it, and what we have to rely on these days are descriptions provided by external sources. And in our case, we're going to stick with the BJCP, in part because that's what we use for all of these short and shoddy episodes. But also, they've really done their work. Gordon and Chris England they've put a lot of work into researching these styles and putting together a really nice cohesive guideline for them. Now, one thing to keep in mind as we go through all of this stuff, and I feel like it's important to point this out when we're talking about such old styles like English IPA, is that the BJCP is a guideline for competing. That's what it's there for. It's for judges to be able to refer to when somebody is submitting, in this case, an English IPA for competition. So in terms of the overall impression that the BJCP provides about English IPA, they describe it as being a bitter, moderately strong, very well attenuated, pale British ale with a dry finish and a hoppy aroma and flavor. Classic British ingredients provide the most authentic flavor profile. That seems very broad to me of a description, Martin. What do you think of it?
Yeah, that covers a lot. And it is interesting, though, to note the difference between that description and then the American IPA, or the many American IPAs that are listed in the BJCP guidelines, actually. And I've always enjoyed when you look at those guidelines, you have the English version of things and then the American version of things, and they're basically the same, except the American one always hoppier.
Yeah, that's exactly it, right? And one of the things that you'll notice is if you go and you look at these two descriptions side by side, we've done episodes on hazy IPA, we've done episodes on American IPA. They're very similar, but the one thing that's different is the ingredients used. So one's you're going to use classic British, the other one you're going to use classic American, whatever it might be. So I do think that there are, as we go through the style descriptions more in detail, there will be some other subtle differences as well. And I think those make all the difference in the world when it comes to these two styles. So real quick, let's blast through some of the style descriptions. In terms of appearance, you're looking for a golden to deep amber color, but usually it's going to be mostly pale in color. It can get up to that kind of amberish color. As we saw as I've seen with beers that I've made, in fact, English IPA, in part because of the use of like darker crystal malts and stuff like that. The clarity, it should be, mostly crystal clear. If you're going to dry hop it and not filter it, a slight haze is okay. That's going to be your polyphenol haze from the hops, typically. And then the foam should be off-white with moderate to persistent retention. Again, this is pretty typical of your classic, any type of IPA because of all the hops that are in it and the strength of the beer. So.
Right, but the aroma is where we move away from sort of typical IPA. So if we look at aroma, the guidelines here are moderate to moderately high floral, spicy, peppery, or citrus orange hop aroma, with a slight dry hop acceptable but not required. So it really isn't emphasizing very bold hop flavors in this. And the aroma also has a pretty large malt component to it as well. So medium low to medium bready or biscuity malt with optional moderately low caramel or toasty malt notes. So when I smell an English IPA, the first thing I normally pick up on is that wonderful biscuity character, and that's what I'd expect to get from an aroma.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that biscuity malt thing is really one of the, again, it's a subtle difference, but it's one of the defining characteristics to me of an English IPA versus the classic, West Coast, we'll call it West Coast IPA, where it's like, hey, we use the malt to get to get the alcohol and then everything else is all hops, right? Obviously, if you look at like Midwest versions of IPA, they're a little bit more English inspired in my opinion, but you can also get a low to moderate fruity aroma as well. That's acceptable. And then a light sulfur note is optional. I don't know why anybody would intentionally want to get a light sulfur note in their English IPA, but if it's there, I guess it's okay if you're judging on this. In terms of flavor, it's mostly going to follow the aroma. You're looking for a medium to high hop flavor that's similar to the aroma with moderate to assertive bitterness, a medium low to medium bready malt flavor with optional biscuit, toast, toffee, or caramel malts. And that's going to be based on the malts that you use in addition to your base malt, if you choose to do that, if you opt to use some specialty or other types of malts. Medium low to medium fruitiness. We're talking about esters here from the yeast use, which we're going to get into a bit later. And then balanced more toward the hops, but also there's going to be a noticeable malt character. That's kind of the key with English IPA, is more balance as opposed to just being hops thrown right in your face. Another note for the flavor component that I think is pretty interesting is that if you are using this higher sulfate water like Burton-on-Trent water, it's perfectly acceptable and maybe even expected to have kind of a minerally note with a dry finish and a hint of sulfur from that calcium sulfate. That can be present in versions made with this higher sulfate water. And then finally, just kind of a clean alcohol flavor can be present in stronger versions. Obviously, if you're making a stronger beer, upwards of 7+% ABV, to kind of pick up that kind of fruity alcohol character, there's perfectly acceptable.
Right. And 7.5%, that's pretty high for a sort of typical English beer, where normally if you think of English bitters, best bitter, ESB and so forth, they're not going to be as high as that. So this can be a little bit stronger than some of the other English styles. Yeah. Then in terms of the mouthfeel, medium body, you don't want any hop-derived astringency in this. In terms of carbonation, fairly highly carbonated. The guidelines recommend medium to medium-high carbonation, and then a smooth alcohol warming in some of those stronger versions when we're up at the 6-7% level.
Yeah, this to me is the mouthfeel thing is kind of like any IPA, right? Any obviously hazy IPA kind of takes things in the mouthfeel realm and flips them on their head. But you compare an English IPA to your classic American IPA, that same thing, medium to light body. You don't really want it to be too astringent. I mean, hop astringency is more common in American versions than English versions, but all of that sounds about in line with me. So the big differences, in my opinion, here in terms of those characteristics is really that balance of the hops and the malt, and then obviously the English malt character as opposed to that modern American fruity hop character. Vital stats, just to run them down real quick, we're looking at 1050 to 1070 OG with a 1010 to 1015 finishing gravity for a ABV range between 5 and 7.5%, 40 to 60 IBU, and then 6 to 14 SRM, which in my opinion, 14 SRM, you're not going to see a West Coast IPA that's 14 SRM. That's pretty dark.
Right. You certainly can get a lot darker with an English IPA than you would do with an American IPA. And as you say, that's because of the malt bill that you might use for this.
Yeah. One thing to define, so what the BJCP will say is that pale ale base malt is not required, but that is the typical go-to that you're going to use. And an obvious choice here is Maris Otter. I mean, who doesn't love Maris Otter for pretty much everything, in my opinion? But there are differences between, and this is something I've seen a lot of confusion on recently. Like if I'm perusing online forums where people are asking about different malts, there's pale malt and then there's pale ale malt. Pale ale malt is, in my understanding, that's leaning more into the higher toast character or the higher toast realm, right? So a Maris Otter is a pale ale base malt. It is not a pale malt necessarily. Pale malt's going to be your classic, like, Great Western or RAR 2-row. That is kilned slightly less than a pale ale malt. So it gets confusing with all of the semantics here. But when the BJCP is saying that an English IPA is going to be made with a English pale ale malt, just call it Maris Otter. That's basically what we're referring to. But you can get like domestic versions here in the U.S. Great Western is a perfect example. They have a Great Western Pale Malt, and then they have their Great Western, or I think they call it Northwest Pale Ale Malt. And they're arguably, or they are made differently. I'm not sure how different they taste in character, but you can get away with using, for example, the Northwest Pale Ale Malt over Maris Otter if you want. Those are probably going to be closer than a pale malt versus the pale ale malt. So that's just, I'm going to get off that soapbox here, but just for an explanation.
Yeah, and Maris Otter is the go-to choice there. The other pale ale malt that you might want to consider is Golden Promise, which is more or less Scottish Maris Otter. It's very similar. It's like Maris Otter in that it is kilned a little bit longer than pale malt, and just using either of those malts, it just brings that biscuity quality, even without any specialty malts. It just brings that biscuity quality to the finished beer.
Which I think you and I agree, and the BJCP listed as well. That is the key to this style. I mean, you can make an English IPA with classic American pale malts if you want to, and you're going to get, if you're using English hops, you're going to get that character. But really, to get the full gestalt, to get that full experience, you got to go with Maris Otter or something like that. Golden Promise is another great choice. One thing about, I think with American, we're spending a lot of time on malts because I think that's a big differentiator here for English IPA versus other types. In American IPA, there's been a movement away from using crystal malt in them altogether. I mean, I know people who are making American IPA with just Pilsner malt these days. For English IPA, throw some medium crystal in there if you want to. That's pretty common. You're looking for that balance of malt and hops. English IPA you can use some refined sugar just to increase the strength without contributing much of anything else. I'm not sure many modern brewers are doing that these days. Maybe some of the bigger commercial breweries are to save some cash, but no other adjuncts really are noted for being included. But obviously the big one here is British hop varieties. That's where the hop character is coming from, are these classic English hops, things like East Kent Goldings, Fuggles. Those are probably the two most traditional, though. Martin, maybe you can school me a little bit on that.
Those are the two that I use in all of my English IPAs. And then for bittering hops, if you want to stick with British bittering hops, Target is a good one. You may also go with Challenger. Bramling Cross, Admiral are another couple of options as well. But yeah, the hops so key to this, and picking some good British hops and picking more than one. So I often like to combine EKG and Fuggle together.
Yeah. So do I. And I'll be honest, I've been brewing for over 20 years. I've been drinking for a little bit longer than that. I've got a podcast. I got a website. I do all that. I've never used Challenger, Target, Bramling Cross, Admiral. I've only used EKG and Fuggles in my English beers. That's my go-to. So I love Fuggles. I'm not the biggest fan of the kind of, I get more of a marmalade orange character from East Kent Goldings. I know a lot of people love that. On its own, not a huge fan, but when you add in a little bit of that earthy kind of mushroomy thing that you get from Fuggles, I get like a sweet mushroom earthy thing, which a lot of people are probably going, ugh. I love that. And so when I blend those two together, that to me is like, yes, we're cruising down London, stopping at a pub, drinking some delicious English beer.
Who would not like a mushroom covered in orange marmalade? That sounds delicious.
That actually does sound pretty good. We might have just invented a new dish to eat with English beers. Yeah, but that is the go-to is East Kent Goldings, or EKG as we're going to refer to it throughout the show, and Fuggle hops. They're both very, very old. I believe they're both landrace varieties, right? They were actually discovered just growing in the wild.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. So, and then finally, you got to ferment this wort that you've made with all of these classic British ingredients with a classic British yeast strain. Now, there are a bunch of these available from all of the various labs. We're going to list a few of them, but it's interesting to me that we classify these strains we're going to talk about as being British when they're used for so many different styles. And most of the American yeast strains that we're using today were still sourced from the UK is my understanding. It's just that we've selected those that don't produce some of the characteristics, the more noticeable characteristics that British yeast are known for. So one of the popular strains is the Whitbread strain. That's your Safel SO4. That comes from the Whitbread Brewery. And then there's the Whitbread Dry. What they classify as Whitbread Dry comes from the same brewery, but it's more attenuative. So that would be like your Imperial Yeast AO1 House or WLP 007 Dry English. Both of those, Safel SO4, I know some people love it. I'm not a big fan of the characteristic I get from that strain, but I love the Whitbread Dry. My absolute favorite British yeast strain, though, is Imperial Yeast AO9 Pub, which is the fuller strain. You can also get that as Y Yeast. I believe it's 1968 London ESB, and then WLP 002 English Ale. Those are all purportedly sourced from the Fuller's Brewery, which is my favorite commercial English brewery. Any other classic British yeast strains people might use, Martin?
Yeah, the Boddington strain. We can't talk about English beer and not talk about Boddingtons. And so that's Imperial Yeast A38 Juice or Y Yeast 1318 London Ale 3. That's another good choice. And like you say, Marshall, these are all good choices for an English IPA, but these are so commonly used in so many different beer styles. I mean,
A38 Juice 1318 London Ale 3, that is the hazy IPA strain, right? I mean, that's what it's known for. Hazy IPA is not an English beer. So that's kind of what I'm talking about is, these are loose classifications. We know where they're sourced from. We know we can kind of predict the characteristics they're going to contribute to the beer. And they are, but using them for this intended purpose, right? English IPA, that's what you want to go with. You want to have some of that ester character, or the classic British ester character. And that's what you're going to get from these. I feel the kind of light Perry ester that I get from the Fuller strain is what works the best, in my opinion, to my palate, for these types of ales, including English IPA. So let's run through real quick the traditional brewing process. Again, traditional brewing process. We don't really know exactly how they were doing it 200 years ago, but chances are it was fairly similar to basic approaches to brewing that we use today. Now, we can't talk about English IPA without talking about the water. Again, Burton-upon-Trent they're known for their sandstone water, which is very, very hard. I think it's something like upwards of 700 to 800 ppm of hardness. And that's made up of high calcium, high sulfate, high magnesium, and surprisingly low levels of sodium and bicarbonate. But that is the water. I mean, I used to go into the homebrew shop and they would have Burton-on-Trent bags of minerals that you could just throw into 5 gallons of store-bought, spring water or whatever, and you're going to get your IPA water using this. That's how popular that water profile is.
Yeah, and the mineral content is really, really high. So if we look at the sulfate content, it's typically something like 700 plus parts per million of sulfate and about 300 parts per million of calcium. So there's a lot of mineral content in this water, and it's what gives that really distinctive profile.
Yeah, and that contributes a flavor. I mean, a lot of people view water as like enhancing hoppiness, and it does all that, right? It brings out that kind of a high chloride water will bring out kind of that warmth or that malty character. But when you're getting up into the ranges that the Burton-upon-Trent water has, you're going to taste that in some way, and it adds that kind of mineral character that I find very appealing in styles like English IPA. To me, it contributes an element that really brings everything together. In terms of the mash, you're looking at your standard 60-minute mash. I'm just going to kind kind of go through this really quickly because I don't think there's much to talk about here. But standard 60-minute mash, somewhere between 148 and 154 Fahrenheit. That's 65 to 68 C if you live across the pond. Beta amylase, you really want to favor that beta amylase activity so that you can create a more fermentable wort to encourage the dryness that is expected in most types of IPA, including English IPA. So you're going to boil for about 60 minutes to achieve adequate isomerization of alpha acids so that you can get that bitterness that's needed in there, and then also to reduce the risk of DMS. Now, arguably, this was a much bigger issue back in the day when malt modification wasn't anywhere nearly as good as it is today, but still, brewers are relying heavily on a standard 60-minute boil.
That's right. So once we've got that boiled down and we've taken care of that dreaded DMS issue by boiling for a full 60 minutes, fully 60 minutes, then we'll move on to the chilling stage, which is to chill this as quickly as possible, rack as little trub as possible to the fermenter. And then when we're looking at fermentation, we're going to ferment at a sort of standard ale temperature of 66 to 68 Fahrenheit. That's 19 to 20 Celsius. That'll restrain the fusel alcohols, and we don't want too much ester development, so we'll keep it at that sort of temperature. And then for fining, well, we want to keep this fairly clear, so you could use mechanical fining, chemical filtration, you could add a fining agent as well. And then for packaging, well, we want medium to medium high carbonation, we said that earlier, so around 2.5 volumes of CO2, so basically standard carbonation, unless you're looking at serving this in a cask. And if you're looking at a cask ale, you would have a much lower carbonation, somewhere around 1.5 to 2 volumes of CO2.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of us who, again, we're drinking these classic styles here in 2023. I mean, so I tend to prefer any beer from a keg to have about 2.5 or more volumes of CO2. I like it bubbly. In this case, though, if you've never had a traditional English ale served on cask with that low carbonation, but just that creamy mouthfeel and that nice foam on the top, you are really missing out. I went to this pub one time. It was in Minnesota, and they had Bengal Lancer, Fuller's Bengal Lancer, one of my probably the best commercial example of an English IPA that I've had. But they had it on cask, and I've had that beer many, many times just out of the bottle or out of a tap. It was a unworldly experience. I mean, it was so good. I think I had 4 pints of it in like an hour sitting there drinking this stuff. And I think it's like 4.9% ABV or something like that. Oh my God, it's so good. But yeah, if you're going to make one of these and you don't have a nitro pour system, or if you don't have a cask, which most of us don't, or a beer engine, I recommend just carbonating it to the point that you would any other IPA, and then you can figure out ways. There are tricks to knock some of that carbonation out and create kind of the impression of like a cask served beer. So one note as well, if you're going a really traditional route and you're going to find this beer, the British brewers are known for using isinglass, which is a traditional fining agent made of fish bladders. Very interesting stuff, but apparently it works. I've never used it myself, but I've watched numerous YouTube videos of some old timers, using isinglass, and it seems to work pretty well. So basically, when we're talking about English IPA, what we're looking for is that nice balanced bready malt character with British hop aroma and flavor, a little bit of ester fermentation character. All of that comes together to form just this nice, refreshing, drinkable beer. Some notable commercial examples: I mentioned Fuller's Bengal Lancer before. That's my favorite. Meantime London IPA, that's another fantastic version. Worthington White Shelf or White Shield. Those are some of the ones. Are there any that I'm missing there that you particularly enjoy? Yeah,
there's an English IPA served in a brewery in North Carolina, where I'm from, Highland Brewing. They sell Cashmere IPA, which is an English IPA, which is pretty good. But really, the ultimate way to experience this is, as you said, Marshall, through a cask pour at a pub. And we have an English pub, actually, where I live, just around the corner, and they have English IPA frequently on cask with the beer engine, and it's absolutely delicious.
Oh, I wish I could go there right now and do that. We here where I live, we've got plenty of breweries, none that are English focused. They all make English beers, don't get me wrong, but none that have like the full beer engine, serving on cask or anything like that. So I am jealous of you, Martin. Now, not only have I been fortunate enough to try a lot of these incredible commercial examples of English IPA, my absolute favorite, again, being Bengal Lancer from Fuller's, but I've actually brewed a handful myself using, more or less standard methods. Now, Martin, you were curious how one would turn out when brewed using short and shoddy methods. So we're going to get through the results from that when we're back from this break.
After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer, and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts.
Of the various brewing traditions around the world, the British approach isn't one that I would deem as being necessarily convoluted. That said, there are certain, things that most would contend are just good practice. A way to avoid off flavors and ensure the highest quality end product. Well, Martin, you recently brewed an English IPA using methods that probably would have had old Hodgson rolling in his grave.
Yes, indeed. But I am a loud and proud short and shoddy brewer. I absolutely love to brew this way. So this was a pleasure to try this. So here's how it went. So it's a 5-gallon batch that I was brewing. I started my brew day mid-afternoon, 2:58 p.m. I had already collected my full volume of RO water, and then I adjusted that with some water additions. Now, we often don't do that with short and shoddy, but I felt like I couldn't brew an English IPA unless I did have that high sulfate to chloride ratio. So I had a ratio of 200 to 75 sulfate to chloride.
Which is, that's actually lower than what Burton-on-Trent water is, arguably. But, typically we all do short and shoddy different. That's the beauty of short and shoddy is that we're taking our own approach. We're just not worrying about it too much, trying to knock out a beer and see how good it tastes in the end. Usually when I'm doing it, I just kind of go based off of my knowledge of how many, or what the pile of gypsum and calcium chloride look like in batches where I measured it out. And then I just add that to the water without measuring it. You actually took the time to measure this one out because you wanted to ensure that it had the higher sulfate. I think that's perfectly fair. And I think, again, for this style in particular, if you're starting with RO water, which is, maybe 3 ppm of hardness, you've got to add something to it to get those characteristics out of it. So good call.
Yeah, I invested the full 45 seconds to measure out those water salts. Pleased I did.
But water's so confusing, Martin. Come on. No, it's so easy once you get to doing it.
So easy, yeah. So I felt like I couldn't skip that step. So I adjusted my water, preheated it, and then went to mill my grains. So the grain bill for this one, I used Maris Otter as the base malt, so that was 68% of the malt bill. Then to that I added 8% medium British crystal malt, which I believe is around sort of crystal 45 range SRM, and then 4% of caramel 80, so a little bit of a darker malt in there as well. And that's the kind of the combination that I like for a lot of my English beers, for getting that sort of biscuity character.
So I would never have used the caramel 80. What was your thinking in that? What were you hoping to get from that? Because to me, I think of that as burnt sugar. Like that's kind of a burnt sugar. It's very good when used properly. Was that kind of what you were going for, to kind of meld that with the biscuity Maris Otter and medium crystal malt?
Yeah, it was only 4%, and I added it because I just wanted to get the color a little darker. So I was looking to get nearer the 16 SRM for that style. When I have the beer appear, the appearance of the beer in the glass, I do want it to look almost like a British bitter.
Yeah.
So just that slightly darker color, but then to have those hop flavors as well. So that was the reason for adding a little bit of caramel 80.
Cool.
So then when the water was at strike temperature, added my grains, gave them a quick stir just to make sure everything was good. And I mashed at 152 Fahrenheit, that's 67 Celsius, for a grand total of 30 minutes. And that was it. Pulled the grains. So I'm using the claw hammer all-in-one system. So pulled my basket out at 30 minutes. Brought to a boil. I'm using the 240 volt system. So I'm at boil in, I don't know, like 7 minutes from there, I think. So from there, it was time to add in the hops. And the hop schedule that I was using was a mixture of Target, EKG, and Fuggle. So 30-minute boil, that was it. Not the 60-minute boil recommended by the BJCP guidelines. So the hop schedule, for my 30-minute boil, I had 30 grams of Target. That was my bittering hop at 30 minutes. Then I had 30 grams each of EKG and Fuggle at 10 minutes. And then at flame out, I put in another 30 gram of Fuggle.
I love that. That sounds so good, dude. I mean, I'm just such a fan of that blend of Fuggle and EKG. Again, I've had beers made with Target. I've never brewed a beer made with Target, so I can't really, I don't know what to expect from that. But you were using it primarily for bittering, which when we're doing these abbreviated boil short and shoddy batches, you've got to up the amount of your bittering addition because of the fact that the isomerization has half the time to occur than if you're doing a 60-minute boil. So ostensibly, you're going to get some, flavor from that 30 gram. That's about 1 ounce, by the way, a little over 1 ounce. That 30 gram Target addition. Yeah,
that's right. And Target's a fairly high alpha acid hop for a British hop, at least.
Right.
So yeah, it's kind of a good hop for bittering, and you're probably going to get something in the aroma and flavor too. So when my 30-minute boil was complete, I chilled the wort, transferred it to my fermenter, and then took a gravity reading. I got my OG of 1.058, which was a brewhouse efficiency of 62%. Now, I would typically see a brewhouse efficiency for something of this gravity of maybe 68% if I had done a 1 hour mash. So 62% for 30 minutes, not too bad.
I think it's impressive. I'm like you. The higher the OG goes, and the shorter the mash length, the lower my efficiency goes. That's been very, very consistent for me. If I was brewing this one, I probably would have seen anywhere between 58 and 62% brewhouse efficiency. The other thing to keep in mind, these are full volume mashes. We're not sparging at all. So to be able to get this kind of efficiency without having to do a sparge with a 30-minute mash, I mean, to me, that's pretty impressive. And I think it shows that you can get away with, these types of abbreviated approaches, at least when it comes to the mash, and still have, and the boil, I suppose, and still have decent efficiency.
That's right. And it's the consistency that's important for me. And I do consistently see, if I mash for 30 minutes with a sort of a medium gravity beer, 62% brewhouse efficiency is something I can rely on. So I can sort of scale my recipe based on that.
Exactly.
And then just throw in a few more grains to make sure I reach the numbers that I'm looking for. So at that point, then I was ready to pitch my yeast. I also like the fuller strain, so I went with Imperial Yeast A09 Pub. And at that point, my brew day was done. It was 4:38 p.m. and I had been slaving away for 1 hour and 40 minutes.
1 hour and 40 minutes. That is, I think you might have beat my best actually on that one. Maybe I have one where I did like a 20-minute mash and 20-minute boil where I was about an hour and a half in, but I mean, come on. You had a batch of beer made in an hour and 40 minutes. That's crazy.
You can't beat it. So
you can't beat it.
So for the fermentation, I have a glycol set up. So I hooked up the glycol and I set the temperature to be 68 Fahrenheit, 20 Celsius. And I just kept it at that temperature all the way through until cold crash. About 3 days into fermentation, I still had a dry hop addition to add. So I wanted to add EKG as the dry hop. So I added 30 grams of that after 3 days. And then 4 days later, so about a week in total, there were no visible signs of fermentation. I took a hydrometer measurement, and the beer had reached a final gravity of 1.012, indicating a 6% ABV beer.
So far, this is sounding just perfect. I mean, 6% ABV, 10, 12 FG. So it's not, I know that FG isn't necessarily correlated with sweetness like a lot of us were led to believe, but I mean, that's a nice, dry, well-attenuated beer from 1058. I mean, nothing seems amiss at this point. So I imagine you proceeded on, you pressure transferred this beer to a CO2 purge keg, as we do all the time, because we're not trying to make some gross oxidized beer. Did you use any finings or anything for this guy?
Unfortunately, I was fresh out of fish bladders, so I did not fine.
Just head down to the creek and figure it out, man.
Yeah, but I put the beer on gas in my Kiza for a week, carbonated to maybe 2.5 pounds of pressure. I don't know, but I have it set at about 25 psi and hold it there for a few days, and then move it down to serving pressure, and it was ready for evaluation.
All right. Well, so again, like I mentioned earlier, this beer, by the looks of we've done a lot of short and shoddy beers over the years. I've made quite a few myself, and for the most part, they tend to come out well. And just based on, your methodology and your numbers and all of that stuff, everything's looking really good. So the first thing that we have to judge is the way the beer looks. I'm looking at the picture right now. I have it up on my screen. It does have that kind of medium amber color, very slight haze to it, but you did dry hop it, you didn't filter it, you didn't fine it. So that all makes sense. That fits within the BJCP guidelines. Probably a little bit darker than 14 SRM, but you were going for that. So we're all good there. The foam just is this thick, white, creamy looking foam. By the looks of it, pretty good.
It looked, touch darker than I was expecting, but really it looked the part. It was looking pretty promising at this stage.
So, brewers are some critical people, right? I would contend we dig into the things that we brew, we dig into the things that other people brew, and we try to find. It almost feels like sometimes we aim for faults more than we do the good stuff. But one could contend that we are our own worst critics, that when we brew a beer, we're the ones finding the fault when other people may not even notice it. What did you think of this, by the looks of it, perfect English IPA when you actually pulled it up to your lips and took a sip of it, Martin?
It was a crushing disappointment. I couldn't believe it. This is a beer style that I've brewed many times, using a recipe that I've brewed several times as well. And I took a sniff, and instantly, just from the aroma, I could tell there was something wrong, because the first thing I expect to pick up, we mentioned this already, is that biscuity, malty aroma. And there was absolutely none of it. All there was this kind of strange chemically note to the aroma. Not good at all. So that was the aroma, and I was like, oh, maybe it's just one of my aroma hop problems. My dry hopping didn't quite go as planned or something. So I took a taste, and there was a little bit more malt flavor on the taste, but it had that same chemical thing going on in the aftertaste. Hop character, basically almost no hop character that I could detect in an IPA. It was just not how I wanted that batch to turn out.
So, chances are that's just because you're being critical of your own beer. So before we get into your thoughts about what you think went wrong, let's go over some of the blind taster results. Now, usually what we're doing is we're serving these to people at a homebrew club or at, the local brew pub, people before they've had too much to drink. But when we serve them to people, we don't tell them anything about the beer other than the style, and we provide the BJCP style description. So they have something to kind of anchor to as they're evaluating it. Now, you actually had the privilege, in my opinion, to serve this to some more astute tasters, if you will, local brewers in your neck of the woods, right?
Yeah, it was incredible. So I'm friends with the head brewer at Ancillary Fermentation in Raleigh, and he set up a whole tasting session for me at his brewery. So we went into the brewery on a day that it was closed, just to taste some of my beers. And it was a who's who of the commercial brewing Raleigh area. It was incredible. So we had commercial brewers there from multiple breweries. We had the owner of the homebrew shop from Atlantic Brew Supply was there, where I got my ingredients. We had the instructor from the community college that teaches the commercial brewing class were there. They were all there to taste my beer. And I was bringing them this English IPA.
I can't wait to hear what they thought about it. Now, just a side note, if you want to actually watch the people review this beer, you can. Martin covered this on the Brewlosophy show. If you just go look through all the videos or you search for Brewlosophy English IPA, you will find that it's pretty great. He didn't break it down as much as we're going to here, but it's a great video. And I love your humility on this one, Martin. So in terms of how hoppy, malty, and dry the beer was, this group of tasters rated on average the strongest characteristic as being its dryness, which seems a little odd to me for an English IPA, and that yielded an average of 3.1 out of 5. They rated the maltiness as about a 3 out of 5, so pretty close, to the dryness. But the hoppiness was the lowest rated, and it was 1.9 out of 5, so not very hoppy at all. Is there anything you want to comment on about that, Martin? It sounds like that aligns well with your evaluation of the beer.
A score of 1.9 out of 5 for hoppiness for an IPA. It's remarkable.
Maybe it was the hops. You got bad hops. Let's just blame it on that. So breaking down those characteristics a little bit more, these are, again, on a 0 to 5 scale. So in terms of hop character, 8 out of 20 people, this isn't on a 0 to 5 scale. These are people who rated the actual characteristic of each of these things. So in terms of hops, 8 out of 20 people thought that the hops were earthy, which I guess kind of goes, with like the Fuggle hop character. 5 rated it as being spicy. 2 each said floral and berry, and 1 each said fruity, pine resinous, and dank caddy. Nobody endorsed melon or onion garlic, which, hey, let's call that a win, Martin.
There we go. Yeah. The one time I score high on onion and garlic, that's why I'm hanging up on my brewing boots.
Well, it's, it used to be an issue, a bigger issue back in the day. And what we learned, or at least what I've been told by folks up in Yakima, is onion garlic tends to be a function of time on the bind. So they try to pick those hop, like Simcoe is one that was known to throw off kind of an oniony characteristic if it stays too long on the bind. So thankfully you didn't have that, but I'm a little suspect about 5 people thinking that spicy is the main characteristic, hop character in this beer. In terms of the malt character, 8 out of 20 people rated cracker bread crust as being the main hop character, but that makes sense to me. 4 people noted nutty, 3 people put roast. I have to imagine they were somewhat biased by the color of this beer, but that's neither here nor there. 3 people thought it was roasty. 2 each said toasty and chocolate, and 1 person put caramel sweet. All of that sort of makes sense. I do think it's interesting. Usually we see more of a, people kind of, there's more people saying one than any of the other. It's not quite a big spread that we're seeing here.
Yeah, so this was a little more comforting that people were picking up a little bit on the cracker and bread crust. I was not expecting chocolate to come up at all, but I was pleased to see that the caramel sweet was just 1 person. So adding in some caramel 80 didn't result in a beer that's cloying or too sweet, at least.
Yeah, I mean, 4% caramel 80, that's not bad. That really is going to add maybe a touch of something just like kind of like salt, it amplifies the flavor, but also that color, like you said. So not surprising there. Yeast character, 13 out of 20. So we can finally say a majority of people did rate esters as being the most notable yeast character. It's an English beer, so at least we got that going for us. But unfortunately, 4 people put phenolics, and we provide a little description of phenolics as being like peppery, spicy, right? And so again, this is going with that spicy hop character. You got 4 people noting a phenolic fermentation character. 3 people thought it was clean. Those people can come hang out at my house and make me feel good about myself all day long. And then nobody endorsed sulfur or wild.
Yes. So again, the esters stuff, well, I was pleased with that. So we got that at least. So the yeast character, I think, from my own impressions of it, that was the only thing where I could, it still tasted like a British beer from the yeast characteristics. So it at least had that going for it.
Well, and for those of us who have used the Fuller strain as much as you and I have, I mean, that's one of my favorite strains for so many different styles of beer. You get good at kind of picking up the characteristics that strain gives off. And so that's good to know that at the very least, you got the kind of expected fermentation character. Now, Martin, I'm really proud of you because for the first time, I mean, you've been on board for less than a year at this point. You know, you're doing your thing, but you are breaking records. And here's one that I'm really proud of you about. I've never seen in a short and shoddy batch, or actually anything that we've done with Brewlosophy, more endorsed off flavors than I did on this one, dude. So congratulations. 3 people noted this beer as having an astringent off flavor. 1 person put acetaldehyde. 1 person put diacetyl. 2 people put estery. 2 people put phenolic. 2 people put oxidized. And 2 people thought there was a solvent off flavor. Amazing work you're doing here, Martin. Tell us about this.
Truly an honor. But you know, when you first showed me this chart and it comes in bar graph form, and it's like, oh my goodness, I couldn't believe it. But I think the interesting thing about this off flavors panel, apart from just the sheer volume of them, is that there's such a wide variety and there's no real agreement. Like if everybody was saying oxidized, then yeah, I probably screwed something up along those lines. But it's like nobody could quite put their finger on what was wrong with it. And I said the same myself when I tasted it. It's just got this kind of off chemical smell to it and taste to it, but I can't really put my finger on what's wrong. And that seems to be what these results say as well.
I love the way you think, because that's where my brain went as well. And I mean, nobody's perfect, and we've all brewed that one batch where you're like, what the hell went wrong here? Mine actually happened to be a short and shoddy, I believe it was a session IPA. You can go read about that. I think we've done an episode on it as well. Similar thing. I mean, you broke my record, but it was the same deal where everyone was just kind of like, what something's wrong with this? And I didn't really do anything different, so sometimes that just happens. But we are going to get into some ideas here in a second, but to finish up the survey results, we ask people after they've done all of this evaluation to just rate the beer in terms of how well they think it represents the style in general based on the BJCP description that we provide, and then their preference for the beer. So this is some good stuff here. For the first time, I believe, nobody felt that this was a spot-on representation of an English IPA. And I'm sorry about that, Martin. I know that hurts your feelings, but nobody gave it a 5 out of 5. 8 people, though, rated it a 4 out of 5. Either these folks thought that you were taking it personal or something, is my guess, or they think English IPA tastes like shit, because I don't know what's going on here. 4 out of 5 seems pretty high for a beer that is, I didn't get to taste it, thankfully, but 4 out of 5 seems pretty high for a beer that you're describing personally as being as awful as it was.
I think this goes to show that, these people were being nice with all of these terrible scores. They were still being nice.
I guess so. We asked them not to be, and to be honest, and you're not going to hurt our feelings, but 6 people rated it a 3 out of 5. 1 thought a 2 out of 5. I'm assuming that one person was like, yeah, I picked up that fermentation character, so I'll give it a 2. 3 gave it a 1 out of 5, and then 2 gave it a 0 out of 5. I don't know if I've seen that many people give it a 0. They're like, this sucked. In terms of how it represents the style, even. I mean, it didn't even come close for those folks.
I didn't even think there was a 0 score, so it was quite interesting to get 2 votes for 0.
They just added it on there. Like, it's not even a 1 out of 5, dude. In terms of preference, it's not going to be that much different than the representative of style question. 1 person gave it a 5 out of 5. They fat fingered that one, I'm assuming. 2 people gave it a 4 out of 5. 3 people gave it a 3 out of 5. 6 people gave it a 2 out of 5. 2 people rated it a 1 out of 5. And then finally, you had 6 people who gave it a 0 out of 5. So, a majority of people were in the 2, 1, or 0 out of 5 camp here. I mean, this beer just was not very good. We just got to call a spade a spade.
So my big day in front of the brewing royalty of Raleigh, North Carolina, and this is what I brought them.
That's what friends are for, though. Thankfully, they're your friends, right? Like, we've had beer from you that's way better than this piece of crap. So what do you think? I mean, we don't usually focus on talking about what we would have done differently to make it better in much detail, but I think this one, warrants some discussion. What do you think went wrong? You and I had many conversations about this. I know that you talked with some of the brewers about this as well. Based on your approach, this is not, in my opinion, there's really no way to determine this, but in my opinion, the short and shoddy approach isn't what caused this problem. There was something else amiss. Did you ever determine what that might be?
Yeah, so everybody has an opinion as to what it was. And when the video was released of this brew day out on the Brewlosophy Show YouTube channel, there were a lot of people putting comments as to what it could be. And really everything from just the recipe itself, the people saying, EKG and Fuggle together. I always get this kind of thing with Fuggle as well. You shouldn't have put Fuggle in. So some people picking on the recipe, thinking that might have been the reason. Somebody was asking about my grain age, so how old was the Maris Otter, and that sack of Maris Otter had been sat in my basement for I think nearly 2 years, but it's been in Vittel's vault and it's been kept dry out of the light and so forth. Tastes fine, so I didn't really think it was that. And then even down to kind of weird process things, like I normally take my grains, run them through my grain mill and put them into a bucket and then tip them into my kettle into the basket. But this time I happened, for the first time ever, just to mill directly into the basket that comes with the claw hammer system and then just dump that straight into the hot water. Someone said, hey, you don't normally do that. Maybe that's the cause. So,
no. I mean, You're right. Everyone has their opinion. And they're right. They have a right to it. So, okay.
Everyone has an opinion. So what I decided to do was to take a couple of the opinions that I thought might be the cause and to re-brew this beer. So I made the exact same beer using the same process, but just with a couple of tweaks. So the things that I didn't change because I just felt were not an issue was I felt the recipe was solid, so I used the exact same recipe. I felt that the short and shoddy process itself was solid. 30-minute mash, 30-minute boil. I was totally fine with that, so I kept that the same. Really, the biggest difference was in the water that I used. So the water that I used the first time was from one of these RO refill stations outside a grocery store. So you've probably seen these where you can just take your 5-gallon jugs and you can fill them up from the grocery store. And what comes out is pretty low in mineral content, and it's heavily filtered. And I basically can consider it RO water. When I take my when I take a measurement, I'll get something like 3 or 4 ppm of whatever mineral is in there. So it's generally pretty clean. Now, I happen to have kept a little bit of that water left over from the brew day, and I revisited it, and I just tried a sample of it, just the water itself, which I didn't do the first time, and I realized that there was a bit of a chlorine taste to this water that had come out of the machine. Now, to me, that shouldn't be there because these machines advertise that they strip this stuff out. It goes through a number of filtration processes. But when I compared that water to the water that I could get from my own RO water system at home, it tasted quite different. Now, the interesting thing about this is when I brewed this beer, it was in the spring, and my town's water supply was going through its annual chlorine flush. So the tap water definitely had a very an odor swimming pool of it. It really would smell quite chlorinated. But I figured, don't need to worry about that because I'm using this fancy RO water that I'm paying for outside of the grocery store. It'll be fine. But it seems that the level of chlorine was sufficiently high that it was still getting through their filters into my brewing water. So really, when I brewed this beer again, the only significant difference I made was to use different RO water that I'd collected at home outside of this chlorine flush, and brewed that beer up, fermented it. We didn't collect data on this one, but I brewed it with a friend, had him come over, we tasted it together. My goodness, that beer is delicious. It's still on tap today. I absolutely love that beer. In fact, when people come over, they are only having 1 pint of that because I do not want to kick that keg. It's absolutely wonderful. So I think it was the water.
When I hear chemical, I'll be honest, my brain goes right to water. And I think I was one of when we were talking about it, I was one of the people who was like, I know you got the RO water from the store, but you got to check it out. That's got to be the issue here. And my first thought was chloramine, which has a chlorine-like character as well. Chlorine actually volatilizes pretty quickly. It's fairly easy to get rid of. Chloramine, not so much. You really do need to use some sort of a potassium metabisulfite or something like that, or Campton, to knock it out. And so, these machines, obviously, you kind of kind of proof in the pudding, aren't perfect. Those filters inside those machines are going to get old, and they're pulling water from the same source you are. They're just running it through a filter. So if your municipality has high chlorine, they've got to filter out all that chlorine when you're going to use these machines. So I'm glad that you figured it out. And just to say, anybody listening to this show who's been wanting to try an English IPA, because of that secondary experience in that second batch that you made, Martin, I imagine you're comfortable saying that this recipe is an absolute winner. Just make sure that your water is good, because this, your experience making the better version does kind of prove that the issue was highly likely with the water. There was an issue with the water, and I think that's a good thing to know.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, I do think it is chloramine rather than chlorine that has been the issue. And the RO filter that I bought for myself at home, which was as a result of this, actually, I bought the special filter that it removes chloramines from the brewing water. So I will not have this problem again.
Yeah, and chlorine is going to leave. I've made beers that I very intentionally, just to test things out, I'll make like a pale lager where I wasn't filtering my house water. I've got good water at my house, but it's got a small amount of chlorine in it. But like you, depending on what they're doing at our substation, there are times where we have higher chlorine than other times. And so I made a pale lager. I've made multiple batches like this, but this in particular, a pale lager. The chlorine does add a very unpleasant character, but you can kind of look past it. Chloramine doesn't do that. It tastes like green water hose, or chlorophenol, or like chloroseptic minus the cherry. It's that medicinal, gross Band-Aid. People say it's not good. You don't want that in your beer. You're going to get a chemical off flavor that's going to mute all of the other good stuff that you want to be there. So mind your water. Make this recipe if you want a nice version of an English IPA. Just again, do good water. Now we do have a couple of reader comments. I know there's a ton of comments on the YouTube channel as well for this episode, so you can go watch that, read those comments. But a couple that people left on the article we published. One comes from Greg S. from Minnesota. He says, the earthiness may have come from the combination of caramel 80 and Fuggles. I tend to find the higher caramels will impart it. Do you have any ideas what difference in the short and shoddy version may have given the chemical note? That's certainly an unfortunate and unexpected flavor. I think we just covered that pretty well, that it was likely the water.
Yeah, I think we can say that. In terms of Fuggle and then a sort of a high SRM caramel malt, I've not really had any problems with that. That is a recipe I've used a few times, so it's worked for me.
Yeah, same deal. I've used, I don't know if I've ever used specifically caramel 80 with Fuggle, but I've used caramel 60 with Fuggle a lot. In fact, that's Tiny Bottom Pale Ale. That was my spin on an English IPA hybrid with an American Pale Ale, in fact, and I use C60 with Fuggles in that, and it's phenomenal. I love it. I get kind of an earthy thing, but it's very enjoyable, right? It's intended. So, final comment comes from Troy Case, who said, "Why do you think this one missed the mark? If there was only one thing that you would change, what would that be? I struggle with English ale yeast. It seems that there's a little room for error." Again, we've already covered what it was. It was the water. But Martin, anything else you wanted to add? Or
yeah, this is the thing. When I went back and looked at this recipe, I really felt that there was nothing wrong there, and the process as well was just fine. So I think we could really just narrow it down to what it was, which is too much chloramine in the finished product.
And that's got to be what it was, and well, in the starting water that ultimately carried through to the finished product, and it's you get that chloramine into a fermentation environment, and it's going to wreak havoc. It's gross. So mind your water. We can't say it enough. But all in all, you did brew a second batch. It was the same exact thing with better water, and it was a fantastic English IPA. The yet again confirming that short and shoddy works. You don't have to be afraid to abbreviate your brew day, and if it keeps you brewing because you don't have to spend 6 hours in your garage on a weekend, just try it out. I think you're going to enjoy it. And if you make this recipe, please let us know what you think. I think Martin and I would both appreciate that. That is all the time that we've got for English IPA and your version that you made using short and shoddy methods. Martin, is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up?
Well, despite my cautionary tale, I would like to advocate for this beer style. It's fast to brew, it's fast to ferment. It can really be ready in about 2 weeks or so. And unlike an American IPA, which really has a shorter shelf life, because it's not so highly hopped, it stores quite well as well. So I am all down for this beer style.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. It's also more weighted towards the malt. It's not a malty beer, but it's got more balance. And so that is going to allow for, even if the hops drop off a little bit with time, you're still getting that nice English malt character. So I agree. Make some English IPA. Let's bring this style back into the spotlight. All right, remember to subscribe to the Brew Lab podcast, where host Kay Jobe takes you into the lab with brewing experts so you're notified when episodes drop. And don't forget that you can click the link in the description of this episode to read all about this short, shoddy English IPA. And again, it's also on the YouTube channel. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.